So, to start off, the embargo on Cuba was an act placed on Cuba from the United States around the 1960s. At first, it was just a policy put in place by President Eisenhower, but in 1962, the United States President John F. Kennedy ordered a total economic embargo on the country of Cuba, which included travel and imports. One very important figure involved was President Dwight David Eisenhower. He was the 34th President of the United States of America. In 1958, he was becoming more aware that Cuba was being ruled by a brutal president, Fulgencio Batista, so he withdrew military support, which eventually put Fidel Castro in charge. He also came up with the idea that the next president, JFK, would have to complete an invasion of Cuba. Another important figure involved was President John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States of America. He implemented the invasion at the Bay of Pigs and was in office during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where he created a quarantine around Cuba in order to stop the building of lethal nuclear missiles. The final major figure involved was Fidel Castro Ruiz. He became the Cuban Prime Minister and the first Secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba. He was also the one who led the Cuban Revolution in 1959. He was a major influence on the embargo on Cuba because before he started the Cuban Revolution, the United States was happy with Cuba. Though Cuba was under influence of a brutal leader before Castro, communism wasn't going to become the best government either. One short-term cause of the embargo on Cuba was when Fidel Castro started the Cuban Communist Uprising in 1952. The United States sided with the brutal leader of Cuba, Batista, only because they were afraid of communism, not because they agree with him. After the communists win in 1959, the United States was still terrified of communism expanding to other governments, so they set up an embargo to strangle Cuba's economy. One long-term cause of the embargo on Cuba was when Fidel Castro took power over Cuba and started a new economic regime. In 1960, the Cuban government took over all United States businesses in Cuba, which causes President Eisenhower to cut ties with Cuba. This led to the United States cutting the import quota on sugar, which also meant that Cuba had to find a new trading partner for sugar. For that, they turned to the Soviet Union, which just made relations worse, with the Cold War going on and such. Another cause happened in 1996, when Cuba shot down 2 United States aircrafts, which led President Kennedy to pass the Helms-Burton Act. The act further extended the blockade by punishing all foreign companies that took part in business with Cuba. A consequence because of the embargo on Cuba was that the United States and Cuba were losing money. Before the embargo, the United States accounted for about 70% of international trade with Cuba. With the embargo in place, Cuba's government had lost $685 million each year. But that's nothing compared to the United States, who loses $1.2 billion annually. Another consequence is that populations suffer, both the U.S. citizens and Cubans. Cubans are having medicinal drug and food shortages, equipment failures, and lack of clean water supplies. These issues are causing delays in diagnosis and treatment, increases rates of waterborne diseases, malnutrition, premature death, and unnecessary suffering to the Cuban population. Americans could be surviving from meningitis B, since according to the AAWH, the Cuban vaccine for the disease is the most advanced today. Of course, Cubans are suffering far more than the U.S. population, and it's all thanks to the embargo against them. One major event involved in the embargo on Cuba is the Bay of Pigs. When John F. Kennedy first took office, there was already something the former President Eisenhower, had planned. President Eisenhower planned to remove Fidel Castro from office by force, but evidently he himself wasn't in office at the time to make it happen. So JFK had to complete the mission in 1961. When the invasion started at the Bay of Pigs, though, Castro was ready. JFK was hoping that when the U.S. invaded with the help of Cuban exiles, others would raise up and fight alongside them too, but that wasn't the case. Nobody stood up and helped the exiles, so they were captured, and Castro became more furious with the U.S., which did not help relations at all. Another major event involved with the embargo on Cuba was the Cuban Revolution. A young Fidel Castro was upset that the U.S. had control of the political and economic systems in Cuba, and he just wanted to see to it that the weaker classes of society were protected, since under the former leader of Cuba, Batista, they weren't. The Cuban Revolution started January 1st, 1959, after Cuban military dictator Fulgencio Batista fled the country. When Batista fled, Fidel Castro took it upon himself to become the new leader that Cuba has been waiting for. The final major event involved with embargo on Cuba was the Cuban Missile Crisis. During October 1962, the Soviet Union and the United States came so close to war because the Soviets had nuclear missiles in Cuba. Since the U.S. cut all ties with Cuba, Cuba had to make new ties somewhere else, like with the Soviet Union. During their alliance, Fidel Castro met a Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, who was upset that the United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey, which was very close to the Soviets. Even though the Soviets didn't have any nuclear missiles near the U.S., they could still reach them. Although the Soviets' missiles could reach the United States, Khrushchev thought it would still put fear in the U.S. to have nuclear missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles away from the coastline of Florida. So the Soviets started to ship missile equipment to Cuba behind the United States' back and almost came close to finishing the build when the NSA intercepted and found out. On October 24th, the U.S. created a quarantine around Cuba so no more Soviet ships could go in or out. And on October 26, Khrushchev gave in and offered the removal of the missiles, but only if the U.S. removes their missiles in Turkey. Though this didn't help or weaken Castro, it was a major point in the Cold War, and should be noted that Cuba was involved in almost starting the nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.